Welcome to the Practical NLP podcast with me, Andy Smith. This week we're continuing with our exploration of strategies as we discover how to elicit strategies using the TOTE model, which you'll remember from last time stands for Test, Operate, Test, Exit. You'll find it much easier to elicit strategies if you keep the TOTE model in mind as a roadmap to tell you where you are in the strategy, which tells you what questions to ask. So for the first test, you'd ask, how do they know when to start running the strategy? What starts it off? For the operate section, what you want to know is, what's the sequence? What is the representational system of each step? And, usually, what are the submodalities of each step? For the second test, you want to know, how do they know if they succeeded? What tells them that they have to go round again? And for the exit, the question is, when do they stop running the strategy? So for a formal strategy elicitation, you'd ask questions appropriate to each step. The difference between a formal and an informal strategy elicitation is that with the formal elicitation, you explain what you're doing as much as you have to, and that usually gives you more time to go into as much depth as you need to in order to get the whole strategy and the submodalities of each element. You can even video the elicitation if they're up for that, to make sure you don't miss anything. With informal elicitation, you get the person talking about the activity you want to elicit the strategy for, and just notice the steps they go through as they tell you. You can get a long way with just keeping the TOTE model in mind to guide your questions. Just as the best time to anchor a resource state is when the person is in it naturally, the best time to get high quality information about a strategy is when the person is actually doing it. Otherwise, you want them to fully associate back into a memory of a time when they were doing the strategy, so they can tell you about it. So the following steps apply whether you're doing a formal or an informal elicitation. Step 1. Get into rapport and set the frame as much as you need to. If it's needed, you might explain in as much depth as you need to, but no more, what strategy you want to elicit and the steps you're going to go through. Or you might just use a softening frame such as, I wonder if I can ask you some questions about that because it will help me understand your business better, or whatever's appropriate in that context. Step 2 is to get the person associated into a time when they were doing the strategy. Let's call this strategy X, which could be a state, like feeling motivated, or an activity or skill, like decision-making or coming up with ideas. The standard question you'll see in NLP textbooks for eliciting a time when they did a strategy is, can you remember a time when you were totally X'd? That will probably work if they've followed you into the appropriate state. Or, just as with state elicitation, you may need to help them get there with questions like, what is it like when you X? Or, how do you X? In any case, you want them to get associated into a particular memory of a time when they X'd and tell you all about that. When you do the elicitation, it helps them to stay associated if you can keep your questions in the present tense. Step 3 is to get the first test and the steps in the operate stage. So you ask, what's the very first thing that makes you X? Or what tells you to start Xing? Then you ask what happens next, and what happens next, and so on. Remember, you're after the representational system and ideally the submodalities of each step, so you may need to ask supplementary questions if their answers are about the content of what they're thinking about. Again, many NLP books will tell you to ask, do you see a picture? Do you say something to yourself? Do you have a certain feeling? I would only ask those kind of questions if I absolutely had to, because with each question, the person has to form an internal representation to understand what's being said. And that might get in the way of the actual next step of their strategy if that happened to be in a different rep system. There's a thin line, I've said this before, there's a thin line between elicitation and installation. So you keep asking, and then what happens? To elicit what happens in the operate stage until you get to the second test, which will be a comparison of the data gathered during the operation with the criteria set up by the first test. So if they're in their decision strategy for buying an article of clothing, they will either get one that matches their criteria, in which case they exit the strategy and buy it, or they loop around again and go through the same operations with another item of clothing. It's quite likely, since they may not be consciously aware of their strategy, that they may have missed out some of the steps when they're telling you about it in their verbal answers anyway. Also, you want to check that the strategy that you've taken down in your notes actually matches their experience. So you'll want to play it back to them to check that you've got it right and to fill in any gaps. And you'll probably want to do that a few times to make sure. How do you know if there are gaps in what you've discovered? Well, try the strategy on in your own mind and see if it works. You'll soon develop a feel for when you've got the whole thing. For example, if the strategy seems to start with an emotion, there's probably something else immediately before it, because emotions are meta-kinesthetics, a response to some external or internal event, even if the person isn't aware of that event. Let's talk for a moment about eye-accessing cues in strategy elicitation. When they answer your questions verbally, people will only tell you what they consciously know about their strategy, although they may become aware of more as you keep asking about it. Fortunately, people will give you non-verbal answers before they even say anything. And these non-verbal answers are often more reliable because the person may not be conscious of their own strategy. In fact, sometimes they will be giving you their strategy non-verbally, even while they're saying, "I don't know." So how do you get the strategy from non-verbal information? If only there was a way to tell what rep system someone's using from moment to moment just by looking at them. Yes, in fact there is. You pay attention to their eye-accessing cues. So you keep the visual of the eye-accessing cue chart, which you'll find in the show notes for this episode, in your mind. And what do you need to check before you jump to any conclusions about what it means when that person moves their eyes in a particular direction? Yes, you need to check whether they're normally wired or reverse wired. Plus, you would also notice any gestures they make, any posture shifts, and you would listen to the predicates that they use. The more associated into a memory a person is, the more their gestures are likely to indicate things or actions in that memory. So if they're associated in the memory of buying an article of clothing, their hand may remember the movement when they tell you about the kinesthetic external step of reaching out and feeling the material. Anything they do is potentially significant. Strategy elicitation is NLP in action. It's all about curiosity about people and about how they do things. The TOTE model and the notation are just there as a way to give some structure and to help you write down the strategies in a quick, easy, and content-free way. Really, strategies are all about people. So why not go and find someone who's really good at something, especially if it's something you'd like to do better, and go and elicit their strategies for doing it? That's it for this week's podcast. Next time we'll discover how to change a strategy that isn't working. As ever, you can find the show notes for this podcast at nlppod.co.uk. And you can also do yourself a favor by signing up for the Coaching Leaders newsletter to get practical tips, how-tos, and book reviews at coachingleaders.co.uk. If you want to catch me live, I'm presenting at a one-day event for business owners and executives in Sutton Coldfield in the West Midlands on the 15th of July. This event is called Rewired, and it's all about how to metaphorically rewire your brain for career and business success. I'll be sharing some practical ways you can use anchoring and submodalities to feel more confident, make better decisions, and perform at your peak. You can find the details and how to book on the coachingleaders.co.uk website in the courses section. See you next time.